The night of July 24th, 1943, Stade, Germany, 23 kilometers west of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Klaus Hermann sits before the Würzburg radar console, his face illuminated by the pale green glow of the cathode ray tube. The bunker is silent except for the low hum of the equipment and the occasional scratch of pencil on plotting paper. For 2 years, he has been the eyes of the Reich's air defense network, watching the British approach across the North Sea with mathematical precision. Every echo on his screen represents an aircraft, every blip a target for the night fighters he guides toward interception. Tonight, at 2200 hours, the screen erupts into chaos. What begins as 12 distinct contacts multiplies into 30, then 60, then hundreds. The screen becomes a blizzard of returns, a solid mass of light that obliterates any meaningful interpretation. Hermann's hand freezes over the plotting table. His training, his doctrine, his entire understanding of aerial warfare tells him that what he is seeing is impossible. No force on Earth could put this many aircraft into the sky simultaneously. Yet the Würzburg does not lie. The British have not simply come in strength tonight. They have come with something else, something that transforms every principle of radar-guided interception into obsolescence in the span of 3 minutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how the most sophisticated air defense system ever conceived was rendered blind by strips of aluminum foil, and how the men who operated it experienced the collapse of technological supremacy in real time. To understand what Klaus Hermann saw that night requires understanding what he believed, what he had been taught, and why the German night fighter system was, until that moment, the most effective aerial defense network in history. The Himmelbett system, colloquially known as the Kammhuber line after its architect, General Josef Kammhuber, was not merely a collection of radar stations and fighter bases. It was an integrated defensive doctrine that treated the night sky over Germany as a controlled battle space, divided into boxes approximately 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. Each box contained a Freya early warning radar, a Würzburg tracking radar, and a dedicated night fighter, usually a Messerschmitt Bf 1-10 or later a Junkers Ju 88. The system's elegance lay in its procedural clarity. The Freya radar, with its range of over 100 kilometers, detected incoming bomber streams and provided initial bearing and distance. Once a target entered a Himmelbett box, the Würzburg took over. With its 360-degree rotating dish and narrow beam, the Würzburg could track a single aircraft with extraordinary precision, accurate to within 100 meters in range and 1/3 of a degree in bearing. A second Würzburg tracked the night fighter. A ground controller, watching both plots on a frosted glass table called a Seeberg display, issued voice instructions to guide the fighter to within visual range of the bomber. On a clear night with good operators, the system achieved interception rates approaching 40%. For the RAF Bomber Command, this was catastrophic. Klaus Hermann entered this system in April 1941, part of the massive expansion of the Luftwaffe's Signals Intelligence and Radar Operator Corps. His training at the Luftwaffe Signals School in Halle emphasized technical precision above all else. The Würzburg was a temperamental instrument, its magnetron tubes requiring careful warm-up procedures, its antenna requiring constant calibration against known landmarks. Hermann learned to read the echoes, to distinguish between ground clutter and genuine returns, to estimate altitude from the shape and strength of the return pulse. He learned that a Lancaster bomber produced a stronger return than a Halifax because of its larger wing area. He learned that aircraft flying in tight formation would merge into a single blob on the screen, and that skilled bomber pilots attempted to confuse tracking by making sudden turns that momentarily broke the lock. But most importantly, he learned confidence. The Würzburg was German engineering at its finest, a product of the same scientific and industrial culture that had produced the V-2 rocket and the Type 21 submarine. The British, Hermann's instructors assured him, possessed nothing comparable. Their radar was primitive, their aircraft lumbering, their tactics predictable. The only thing they had in abundance was foolish courage, and courage without technology was merely a faster path to death. This was not propaganda. This was verified by statistics. In 1941, RAF Bomber Command lost 926 aircraft. In 1942, losses climbed to 1,447. The Kammhuber line was doing its job. By the summer of 1943, Hermann was a veteran, one of the senior operators at the Stade station. He had guided night fighters to over 30 confirmed kills, an achievement that earned him a commendation and a weekend pass to visit his family in Dresden. He knew his aircraft. He knew the rhythms of British operations. The bombers came on moonless nights, usually in streams of 150 to 200 aircraft, targeting the Ruhr industrial cities or the port facilities at Bremen and Hamburg. The Pathfinders arrived first, dropping coloured flares to mark the target. The main force followed, spread over 30 to 40 minutes to reduce the concentration of flak. Hermann and his fellow operators worked with mechanical efficiency, vectoring fighters one after another into the stream, each interception yielding 1 or 2 kills before the fighter had to break off to refuel or rearm. Hamburg was familiar territory. As Germany's second-largest city and its primary Atlantic port, it was a frequent target. The city's flak defences were formidable: 54 heavy batteries, 26 searchlight positions, and a dedicated night fighter wing at Stade. The British losses over Hamburg had been acceptable, manageable, sustainable. In 1942, Bomber Command had struck the city 3 times, losing a total of 41 aircraft. The ratio favoured the defenders. Hermann had personally tracked 4 of those kills. But on the evening of July 24, 1943, the intelligence reports suggested something unusual. The Freya station at Heligoland had detected the British forming up earlier than normal, assembling over the Wash in eastern England in daylight. The number of aircraft was larger than usual. Initial estimates placed it at 750 or more. This was not unprecedented. The 1,000-bomber raids of 1942 had involved similar numbers. What made the operators uneasy was the timing. The British were coming at the beginning of a moonless period, conditions that favoured both the attackers and defenders. It would be a long night. At 2200 hours, Hermann's Würzburg locked onto a contact at a bearing of 285 degrees, range 70 kilometres. The target was crossing the Elbe estuary, heading southeast toward Hamburg. He refined the lock, centering the crosshairs on the bright return pulse, and began calling out coordinates to the ground controller. The night fighter, a Bf 1-10 flown by Hauptmann Dietrich Mührer, was already airborne, circling at 4,000 metres. The interception geometry was perfect. Closing speed approximately 500 kilometres per hour. Time to contact 8 minutes. Then the screen changed. It began as a faint bloom around the primary target, a haze of smaller returns that seemed to multiply with each sweep of the antenna. Within seconds, the single bright blip became 3, then 7, then a solid cluster. Hermann's first thought was formation flying. The bombers were grouping together for mutual defensive fire. But the cluster continued to expand, spreading across 5 degrees of bearing, then 10, then 20. And now there were more clusters appearing, dozens of them, each one erupting from a single aircraft, like a cell dividing under a microscope. "I'm losing track definition," Hermann called into his headset. Multiple returns, very close spacing, attempting to reacquire primary target. He adjusted the gain, trying to burn through the clutter. The main target was still there, somewhere in that constellation of echoes, but isolating it was impossible. The Würzburg's narrow beam, its greatest strength, had become a liability. He could only see a small slice of the sky, and every slice he examined showed the same thing: chaos. The controller's voice crackled in his earpiece. "All stations report the same. We have lost coherent track on all targets. Night fighters are orbiting blind." Hermann looked up from the screen. Through the bunker's narrow window, he could see the searchlights over Hamburg beginning their dance, sweeping across the cloud base in broad arcs. The sound reached him a moment later, the deep, asynchronous drone of hundreds of Merlin engines, a sound that should not exist because the radar was telling him the sky contained not 700 aircraft but thousands. He returned to the scope and tried a different approach. Instead of tracking a single target, he zoomed out, reducing the magnification to capture a wider field of view. The entire screen was bright, not with distinct returns, but with a fog of reflections, each one strong enough to register as a contact, none of them coherent enough to track. The Seeberg display in the operations room, which should have shown an ordered plot of approaching bombers and intercepting fighters, instead showed a solid mass approaching from the northwest, moving at 280 kilometers per hour, altitude varying between 4,000 and 6,000 meters. Every attempt to designate a target for the night fighters resulted in the same response. There were too many returns to differentiate individual aircraft. At 22:15 hours, the first bombs fell on Hamburg's Altona district, then Barmbek, then Hammerbrook. The city's flak opened up, a rippling wall of 88mm and 105mm fire that filled the sky with steel fragments and lit the low clouds from below with orange pulses. The searchlights caught a few aircraft. Hermann could see them as tiny crosses against the glare, but without radar guidance, the flak was firing blind, relying on predicted barrage zones rather than tracked intercepts. The night fighters were equally helpless. Hauptmann Muir's voice came over the radio, frustrated and bewildered. "I'm in the stream. I can see them, but I can't get guidance to a specific target. The entire sky is full of them." What Hermann did not know, what none of the German operators knew that night, was that the British had arrived with 92 million pieces of metal foil. Each piece was precisely cut, 30 centimeters long, 1.5 centimeters wide, 1/1000th of a centimeter thick. They were packaged in bundles of 2,000 strips, each bundle weighing approximately 1 kilogram. The RAF called it window. The scientific principle was simple enough that a first-year physics student could understand it, yet its implementation required 2 years of bureaucratic fighting within the British command structure and a direct order from Winston Churchill himself. Metal reflects electromagnetic radiation. A thin strip of metal, cut to half the wavelength of a specific radar frequency, acts as a resonant dipole antenna, returning a signal disproportionate to its physical size. The German Würzburg operated at 53.5 centimeters wavelength. Half of that was 26.7 centimeters. The British cut their foil to 30 centimeters to account for manufacturing variations and to provide coverage across a range of frequencies. A single strip, tumbling through the air, produced a radar return roughly equivalent to a small aircraft. 2,000 strips, falling in a slow descending cloud, produced a return that completely obscured any genuine aircraft nearby. Multiply that by 92,000 bundles, spread across 791 bombers, and the result was a radar environment that made coherent tracking impossible. The British had known this would work since 1942, when laboratory tests confirmed that Chaff could blind the German radars. But they had delayed deployment for a crucial reason. The Germans could copy it. If window worked against German radar, it would work equally well against British radar, and the Luftwaffe still conducted nuisance raids over England. The standoff lasted for months, with RAF commanders pleading for permission to deploy the countermeasure, while the Air Ministry and the War Cabinet worried about retaliation. The breakthrough came when intelligence reports confirmed that the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of mounting large-scale raids on England. The bomber arm had been gutted to reinforce the Eastern Front. German night fighter production was focused entirely on home defence. Even if they copied window immediately, they had no way to use it offensively. Churchill gave the order in July 1943. The first mission would be Hamburg. The first window bundle was dropped by a Lancaster of No. 83 Squadron at 2202 hours, 10 kilometres north of Cuxhaven. The navigator, following precise instructions from the Pathfinder force, tore open the package and fed the strips into the flare chute. The foil dispersed into the slipstream, each piece tumbling and spinning, catching the moonlight like silver rain. 30 seconds later, every Lancaster and Halifax in the stream began dropping bundles at 1-minute intervals. The orders were explicit. Maintain continuous window deployment from the coast to the target and back again. Each aircraft carried approximately 2,300 bundles. The mathematical result was a corridor of false returns, 30 kilometers wide and 300 kilometers long, a corridor that moved with the bomber stream and made every attempt at precision tracking futile. Klaus Hermann did not understand what he was seeing, but he understood its implications immediately. The Würzburg had become a liability rather than an asset. The system that had made him valuable, that had given him purpose and authority, was now feeding him meaningless data. He could see the bombers physically see them through the window as they passed overhead, silhouetted against the fires beginning to consume Hamburg, but his instruments could not isolate them. The radar that was supposed to provide precision had been reduced to providing only crude directionality. The enemy is somewhere over there, in that general area. Good luck. The psychological impact on the operators was profound and immediate. Hermann had spent 2 years developing an almost intimate relationship with his equipment. He knew its quirks, its limitations, its capabilities. He knew that a skilled operator could track a target through moderate jamming by switching frequencies or adjusting the gain. He knew that atmospheric conditions could create false returns, but these were identifiable by their behavior. They didn't move like aircraft. They didn't maintain consistent bearing and range. What he was seeing now was different. These returns behaved exactly like aircraft. They had the right radar cross-section, the right Doppler characteristics, the right everything except that there were far too many of them, and they were all clustered together in a way that made no tactical sense. Some operators, in those first confused minutes, convinced themselves they were witnessing a technical malfunction. Others theorized that the British had developed a new formation tactic, flying so close together that their radar returns merged. A few, including Hermann, arrived at the correct conclusion almost immediately, but had no vocabulary to express it. The British had found a way to create false targets that the radar could not distinguish from real ones. The mechanism didn't matter. The result was the same. The Kammhuber line, the integrated air defense system that had cost the RAF over 3,000 aircraft in 2 years, had been defeated not by superior aircraft or brilliant tactics, but by metal foil that probably cost less than the fuel in a single night fighter's tanks. The attack on Hamburg lasted 43 minutes. 791 aircraft dropped 2,300 tons of bombs, including large numbers of incendiaries specifically chosen to create firestorms in the densely packed residential districts. The German night fighter force managed to shoot down 12 bombers, less than 2% of the attacking force, a loss rate the British could sustain indefinitely. The flak batteries, firing blind, expended over 16,000 heavy rounds and hit nothing of significance. Hermann sat at his console through the entire attack, watching his screen fill with meaningless data, listening to the frustrated voices of night fighter pilots who could see the bombers but couldn't get vectors to intercept them because the ground controllers had no reliable tracks to provide. When the last bomber cleared the coast at 23:55 hours, Hamburg was burning. The fires were visible from Stade, 50 kilometers away, a red glow that painted the underside of the cloud layer. Hermann powered down his Würzburg and walked outside. The other operators were standing in small groups, smoking, not talking much. The night fighters were returning, landing one by one at the field across the road. Someone had turned on the radio in the operations bunker, dance music, a voice announcing the weather forecast for tomorrow. Nothing about the raid, nothing about what had just happened. Hauptmann Mührer found Hermann an hour later. The pilot was still in his flight suit, his face lined with fatigue and something else, a kind of bewildered anger that Hermann recognized because he felt it too. "I saw them," Mührer said. "I was in the middle of the stream. I could have reached out and touched them, but your vectors kept sending me to empty sky. What happened to the radar?" Hermann had no answer that made sense. "It's not broken," he said. "It's seeing too much." The British came back the next night, And the night after that. And the night after that. Operation Gomorrah, the RAF called it. 4 major raids in 10 days, each one using window, each one achieving the same result. Minimal losses, maximum destruction. The German Air Defense Network, which had inflicted a 10% loss rate on RAF Bomber Command in early 1943, managed only a 3% rate during Gomorrah. The city of Hamburg, Germany's second-largest industrial centre, was functionally destroyed. Approximately 37,000 people died in the raids, most of them in the firestorm that swept through the eastern districts on the night of July 27th, creating winds strong enough to uproot trees and surface temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. The firestorm was not a deliberate creation. The RAF had not yet perfected the incendiary tactics that would later be used on Dresden, but it was a consequence of dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries on a dense-built city in a short period of time. The British had not invented a new weapon. They had simply removed the defence that made the old weapon ineffective. The German response to window was hampered by bureaucratic paralysis and misplaced priorities. The Luftwaffe High Command initially refused to believe that simple metal foil could defeat their radar network. Hermann Göring, who had personally overseen the development of the Kammhuber line, declared that the British must have developed a sophisticated electronic jammer and that German scientists should focus on counter-jamming measures. This was wishful thinking. When samples of window were recovered from crashed bombers and examined, the simplicity of the design became undeniable. The British had not out-engineered the Germans. They had simply thought about the problem differently. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German engineers proposed several countermeasures. The most promising was a modification to the Würzburg radar that allowed it to track based on Doppler shift, rather than simple reflection strength. An aircraft moving at 300 km per hour has a different Doppler signature than metal foil tumbling through the air at terminal velocity. The modification worked, in theory. In practice, it required replacing or extensively modifying every Würzburg radar in the network, a process that would take months and consume resources desperately needed elsewhere. A simpler solution was to add a second radar operating on a different frequency. The British had cut their window to defeat the 53.5 cm Würzburg. A radar operating at 25 cm or 10 cm would not be affected, at least not by the current generation of Chaff. But again, this required manufacturing and deploying entirely new equipment. The interim solution was to abandon precision tracking and return to older methods. Ground-controlled interception gave way to freelance, night fighting, where pilots used their own eyes and onboard radar to find targets within the bomber stream. This required a different kind of aircraft. The older Bf-1-10, designed for ground-controlled interception, was replaced by the Ju-88 and later the He-2-19, which carried airborne intercept radar in their nose cones. The most successful night fighter pilots of the war's later years were those who learned to hunt independently, using the fires below to silhouette the bombers above. But this was reactive adaptation, not systematic defense. The loss rates increased steadily. By December 1943, RAF Bomber Command's loss rate had dropped to 4.1%. By mid-1944, it was below 3%. The Luftwaffe was losing more night fighters than they were shooting down bombers. Klaus Hermann remained at his post through the autumn of 1943, but his role had changed. The Würzburg was still operational, scanning the night sky, but it was no longer the primary tracking system. Instead, it served as a general early warning device, providing crude estimates of bomber stream direction and altitude. The precision that had made Hermann valuable was no longer required. He watched the British raids on Berlin, on Stuttgart, on Nuremberg, and knew that his contribution to stopping them was negligible. In January 1944, he was transferred to the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe was attempting to rebuild its ground attack capability. It was a demotion, though nobody called it that. He survived the war and returned to Stade in 1947 to find the radar bunker abandoned and stripped of equipment. The Würzburg dish was gone, probably melted down for scrap. The broader implications of Window extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat of the Kammhuber line. The introduction of Chaff marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the air war, the point at which electronic countermeasures became as important as bombs and bullets. Both sides began an escalating cycle of measure and countermeasure that would define aerial warfare for the rest of the 20th century. The Germans developed centimetre-wave radar to defeat Window. The British developed new types of chaff cut to centimetre wavelengths. The Germans added Doppler filters. The British began dropping chaff in patterns designed to mimic aircraft formations. The Germans trained night fighters to operate independently. The British introduced dedicated radar jamming aircraft to accompany the bomber streams. But the deeper lesson was psychological. The German air defense network had been built on a foundation of technological confidence, the belief that superior engineering and systematic organization could compensate for numerical inferiority. The Würzburg was the symbol of that confidence, a precision instrument that turned the chaos of aerial combat into a mathematical problem with mathematical solutions. Window did not merely defeat the radar, it defeated the worldview that made the radar possible. It demonstrated that complexity could be defeated by simplicity, that an elaborate system could be rendered useless by an absurdly cheap countermeasure, and that technological advantage was always temporary, always vulnerable to a clever adversary with access to basic materials and basic physics. For Klaus Hermann, sitting in his bunker on the night of July 24, 1943, watching his screen fill with false returns, the lesson was more personal and more immediate. He had been trained to trust his instruments, to believe that technology would tell him the truth about what was happening beyond his line of sight. The radar had been an extension of his senses, a tool that made him more capable, more effective, more powerful. In 3 minutes, that tool became a source of confusion and helplessness. The British had not attacked him physically. They had attacked his ability to understand the battle, to impose order on chaos, to contribute meaningfully to the defense of his country. They had made him blind while leaving his eyes intact. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the 6 months before the introduction of Window, RAF Bomber Command flew approximately 15,400 sorties against German targets and lost 846 aircraft, a loss rate of 5.5%. In the 6 months after Window's introduction, Bomber Command flew approximately 21,000 sorties and lost 793 aircraft, a loss rate of 3.8%. The absolute number of losses declined even as the number of missions increased dramatically. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force, which had been the most effective air defense system in the world in early 1943, never recovered its effectiveness. By the end of the war, more German night fighters were being destroyed by Allied escort fighters and fuel shortages than were shooting down bombers. Hamburg itself never fully recovered from Operation Gomorrah. The destruction of the city's industrial infrastructure, its port facilities, and its residential districts created a refugee crisis that strained Germany's internal logistics for the rest of the war. Approximately 1 million people fled the city in the days following the raids. War production in Hamburg dropped by approximately 75% and did not return to pre-raid levels until late 1944, by which time Allied bombing had shifted to other targets. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was significant enough that Goebbels personally intervened to suppress news coverage of the full extent of the damage. But the most significant consequence of Window was strategic rather than tactical. The defeat of the Kammhuber line meant that RAF Bomber Command could operate over Germany with acceptable losses, which meant that the combined bomber offensive, the Anglo-American strategy of using strategic bombing to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and civilian morale, became sustainable. Without Window, the loss rates of early 1943 would have forced the RAF to curtail or even suspend night bombing operations. With Window, Bomber Command could mount 1,000 bomber raids on a regular basis, systematically destroying Germany's cities while the Americans struck industrial targets by day. The air war over Germany became a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, the side with greater industrial capacity inevitably wins. The irony, which would not have been lost on Klaus Hermann had he known the full story, was that Germany possessed its own version of window and had possessed it since 1942. Called Duppel by the Luftwaffe, it was metallized paper strips cut to defeat British radar frequencies. But the Luftwaffe never used it operationally before the British deployed window, for exactly the same reason the British had delayed: fear of retaliation. And by the time window made that fear obsolete, the Luftwaffe no longer had a bomber force capable of mounting large-scale raids on Britain. Germany had developed the countermeasure and then lost the war before deploying it, while Britain had developed the same countermeasure and won a significant strategic advantage by using it first. The difference between the two outcomes was not technological capability but institutional willingness to accept risk. There is a final detail worth noting: a small human moment in the larger machinery of war. In the operational records of the Stade radar station, there is an entry dated July 25, 1943, written by Klaus Hermann. It reads, in its entirety: "Radar returns, unreliable due to unknown interference. Tracking impossible. Request technical investigation." The language is bureaucratic, emotionless, the kind of report that a competent NCO writes when equipment malfunctions. But between those lines is the recognition that something fundamental has changed, that the rules of engagement have shifted in a way that makes previous training obsolete. Hermann wrote that report before anyone in the German command structure understood what had happened, before the word window appeared in Luftwaffe intelligence briefings, before the scale of the defeat became apparent. He wrote it because he was a professional, because accurate reporting was his responsibility, because someone higher up the chain of command needed to know that the system had failed. That report, filed in a bunker outside Hamburg while the city burned, represents the exact moment when German air defense ceased to function as designed. Not when the British dropped the first bundle of window, not when the Würzburg screen filled with false returns, but when the operator looked at his equipment, looked at what it was telling him, and wrote down for the official record, "I can no longer do my job." The air war over Germany would continue for another 21 months. Hundreds of thousands more tons of bombs would fall. Tens of thousands more aircrew on both sides would die. The technology would evolve jets and rockets, improved radar and counter-radar, guided missiles, and electronic warfare. But the psychological moment of defeat, the instant when the defender realizes that his best weapon has been rendered irrelevant by an adversary's cleverness, occurred on that July night in 1943, in a bunker on the North German plain, in the mind of a young radar operator watching his screen lie to him with perfect conviction. Window was not a wonder weapon. It was metal foil. It cost approximately £5 per ton to produce. The entire British expenditure on window for Operation Gomorrah was less than the cost of a single Lancaster bomber. Yet it achieved what no amount of heroism or tactical brilliance could have achieved. It made the German air defense network obsolete overnight and shifted the strategic balance of the air war permanently in favor of the Allies. The lesson was not lost on military planners in the decades that followed. Electronic warfare became a permanent feature of modern combat, a domain where cheap countermeasures could defeat expensive systems, where intelligence and creativity mattered more than budget and engineering sophistication. Klaus Hermann's story ends quietly. He survived the war, returned to civilian life, worked as an electrical engineer for a telecommunications company in Bremen. He gave one interview to a British military historian in 1967, in which he described the night of July 24th with the same professional detachment he had brought to his wartime reports. When asked if he felt betrayed by his equipment, he said no. The radar had worked exactly as designed. It had reported what it detected. The failure was not technical but conceptual. Nobody had imagined that the enemy would be clever enough to turn the radar's precision into a vulnerability. We thought we were fighting with technology, he said, but we were fighting against it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.